Hello everyone and welcome back to another video on the channel. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. With the release of The Exorcist Believer, I wanted to revisit the original Exorcist film, an absolute instant classic that set the golden standard for possession movies and horror films for the years to come. A film so iconic that it is essentially untouchable and that it took 50 whole years for anybody to even attempt to make a sequel. 50 years! Wait, there were two sequels? One only a few years later and one in 19... Wait... There were two prequel films from the early 2000s. The Exorcist Believer isn't the only film to ruin the legacy of William Friedkin's masterpiece? David Gordon Green may be trying to attempt to make his own trilogy, but first we need to take a look back at the original attempts to live up to The Exorcist and answer the question that everybody's been asking: did The Exorcist ever need a sequel to begin with? And of course, this will be a spoiler review for The Exorcist, The Exorcist II The Heretic, and of course, The Exorcist III, along with some spoilers for The Exorcist Believer. So if you've not seen those films, please beware and proceed with caution. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, Allah. Now, before I get into this film, I want to preface it by saying that everything there is to say about this film has already been said by countless people in so many in-depth video essays that anything I try to do here might feel derivative of all of those videos. So instead, this will be my personal experience with these films, and when it comes to The Exorcist, my thoughts are actually quite complicated. On the one hand, I hate the experience of watching this movie. I always have. At the time that I first watched this film, I hadn't seen a lot of horror films or even analyzed film to the degree that I do now, so there was a lot that went over my head completely. I found the film to be extremely boring, and it failed to keep my interest for most of the runtime. Most of the religious themes were completely meaningless to me, and overall I found it to be very overrated, but worst of all, more gross than actually scary. Yet ever since that first experience, and as I became a student of film myself, aspiring to make horror films one day, I found myself refusing to revisit The Exorcist, and I simply didn't want to experience that film again because of the way it made me feel. The film is undoubtedly unsettling. It knows exactly how to get under your skin, and at the time I placed that feeling more on the discomforts of, the green puke, the rotting skin, the vile acts this possessed girl would inflict on herself and those around her. Yet on rewatch, there's a lot more to what Friedkin does in the edit that makes you recoil in your seat. The film will show you the most vile thing that you've ever seen in your entire life before quickly cutting away to see the characters just sitting there quietly, soaking in what they have just seen, leaving you as an audience member to dwell on those very same things. Jason Miller plays Father Karras in the film, a priest who has been asked by the church to study psychology as an effort to acknowledge the scientific advances that explain certain behaviors that the church at one time may have deemed as demonic possession. And honestly, congrats to the Catholic Church, you've achieved the bare minimum. Pretty progressive of the church if you ask me. But in doing so, Father Karras is starting to believe that his faith is fading away. When confronted with the idea of Regan being possessed by a demon, he immediately brushes it off like everyone else Chris MacNeil has seen. Chris MacNeil is the concerned mother of Regan, played by Ellen Burstyn, who has no faith whatsoever. She simply just never had the time to even consider following any sort of religion. The first half of this film spends a good amount of time following her starting as a concerned mother to slowly becoming more and more desperate to help her daughter. She has all the money in the world, access to the best doctors and psychologists, and even those experts continue to just tell her one thing, that it is some mental illness, but she can't help but to start believing that something more sinister is going on with her daughter. What I love about both of these characters' journeys with Regan's possession is that they both build to a point where you as an audience member feel as they do, that whatever is happening to Regan is truly beyond our understanding and is simply inhumane. Father Karras' first interaction with Regan is brilliant. It's not some big scene where the main character confronts this demon and has a heightened dramatic conversation leading up to the demon stabbing her eyes out in some act of evil violence. No, Regan may be playing the role as devilishly as possible, but Karras remains as collected as he's shown himself to be around others. Yes, we've seen his inner conflict and struggle with faith, but around the majority of people, he maintains his composure to hide his true feelings. Yes, by the end of the scene, he suggests that she may have split personality, sticking to his expertise in psychology, but deep down you can tell that he was truly unsettled by what he had just seen, yet there is just enough doubt given to his character to prevent his faith from fully returning.
I told Regan that was holy water. I sprinkled it on her and she reacted very violently. It's tap water.
Enter Father Merrin. I think this is the character that solidifies my thoughts on why these character interactions sell the horror for me in this film just as much as the possession itself. This is a character that you follow from the beginning whose faith is never once threatened. He is a pure believer and is dedicated to this idea of good overcoming evil. Yet, as we progress towards the end of the film and Father Merrin proceeds with this exorcism, you begin to see him slowly crack under the pressure. The guy who we are supposed to believe is going to solve all the problems in the world, the one who has not had a crisis in faith for the entirety of his life, is suddenly in the bathroom looking down at his hands shaking. Inspires so much confidence to us as an audience. And then he just dies off screen. No flashy performances, no dramatic dialogue, no violence. Karras simply walks in and he is dead. The movie does a great job at knowing when less is more, and in this case, it really was so much more effective this way. What does get all the fanfare in the end is Father Karras' arc. After all the doubts and inner conflict, upon seeing Father Merrin dead, he begins to beat the shit out of this child to continue to punch his feelings away as he's been doing throughout the entirety of this film. He eventually breaks and accepts the fact that this evil does exist and he won't let it harm Regan for one more second. He invites this demon into himself and throws himself out the window in the ultimate self-sacrifice, offering up his soul to save Regan. All this is to say that the build-up to the exorcism in this film and the finale and the end of these character arcs is truly brilliant. And this is still coming from somebody who thinks this movie is kind of boring. Sorry to any hardcore The Exorcist fans, but the first 30 minutes really struggles to keep me focused on what's happening on screen. But the second that Regan walks into that party and starts pissing all over the floor, I instantly snapped into the story as the characters go from their mundane lives to their whole worlds being turned upside down. And can I just say how perfect it is that this turn is so sudden and unexpected? Like, imagine watching this movie for the first time, not knowing the title of the film at all. Like, sure, you see some priest uncovering some religious artifacts at the beginning of the movie with an eerie and unsettling tone, but after that, it's a very normal movie following these characters in their mundane lives. Merrin is doing his thing in Iraq, Chris and her daughter are happy, Karras is punching his feelings away, everything is completely normal, then bam! These characters' lives are thrown together in an instant. There is so much to say about the filmmaking on display here that I can go on for so long, and to my surprise, I've gained a lot of admiration for this movie, even if I still stand by my original thoughts in this movie having a slower first act, albeit those quiet moments do sell the jarring turn into insanity, making it all kind of worth it by the end. But I still have no interest in revisiting this film anytime soon. I simply don't enjoy watching Regan puke gross green goo all over these characters. I don't enjoy the eerie tone of this movie that makes my skin crawl. Yet, this time around, I found everything about this to be intentional and brilliant in its execution. There's still so much more to say about this film as it pertains more directly to the sequel, so let's get on to the good stuff. Let's talk about The Exorcist II The Heretic. This movie sucks. Okay, that may be a bit mean, but it's kind of true. Every single fear that I had after hearing that they attempted to make a sequel to The Exorcist is actually... It's actually not existent here. If anything, The Exorcist Believer is what I expected a sequel that misunderstood what made the first film great would look like. But no, this film actually takes a sharp left turn down fucking insanity. To my surprise, Linda Blair actually reprises her role as Regan in this film, and honestly, respect for cashing in that check for this movie. If anything, the performances here are not necessarily bad. They are serviceable enough for what the script is asking of these actors, but that script is definitely not doing them any favors. Ellen Burstyn does not reprise her role as Chris MacNeil here, along with every single other sequel or follow-up or prequel to The Exorcist up until The Exorcist Believer dragged her back into this role, and apparently she bargained for some scholarships for talented children as her payment, so, way to go, Ellen. If you're going to be in a bad movie, get the most out of it. But what is The Exorcist II The Heretic actually about? Well, a few years after the events of the first film, Regan has no memory of the possession whatsoever. She is still being monitored at a psychiatric facility by Dr. Jean Tuskin, played by Louise Fletcher. A new priest is introduced here to investigate the death of Father Merrin, meaning that the church decided to ignore his death for 4 years? It's only when the church's reputation is put on the line that pushes them to even try to right this wrong that was done to him. So I guess that's on brand for the church. Now, this logline reveals the first major issue that I have with this film. If the demon never left Regan, what was the entire point of Karras' arc in the first film? Why did I spend so much time investing into this character's journey just for his inner conflict and ultimate sacrifice to end up completely meaningless. But the idea that this demon is still with Reagan isn't the only dumb thing about this concept. It's the fact that the only reason this demon returned into prominence in this film is because this priest went looking for it. If this guy did absolutely nothing, the events of this film would not have happened and everybody would go on with their lives without any issue. But you know what? I accept it. It's fine. I'm not mad. I'm just a little bit annoyed at this point. Let's give this movie a chance to win me over. And honestly, there is still some good things in this movie. And although it is dumb that the demon never left Reagan, the scene where Dr. Tuscan goes searching in her mind to find out exactly what happened to Marin, it is handled pretty decently with some genuine atmosphere. They hook themselves up to this machine called the synchronizer that essentially syncs their brainwaves from the doctor to the patient in order for them to see into the mind of the patient. Dr. Tuscan clearly sees something that she didn't like because she becomes completely lost in Reagan's mind, keeping her in a coma of sorts. And we don't see exactly what she saw, but knowing the first film, I'm sure it couldn't have been good. And if we were to stop here, if the scene just cut at this point, honestly, it would have been pretty great. It would have maintained some mystery, the atmosphere and tension in her becoming lost in her mind adds some stakes, and it gives Father Lamont even more reason to be concerned about Reagan. However, the scene does not end here. The movie makes a dreadful mistake of trying to over-explain every single little moment from either this film or from the first film that never needed explanation whatsoever. Father Lamont decides to hook himself up to the machine and try to retrieve Tuscan from Reagan's mind, which allows us as an audience to see into the mind of Reagan, to see some footage of that first film. And unfortunately for us, this also means that we get to see what happened to Father Marin when the first film purposely left that as a mystery. So yeah, remember me praising how less was more in that first film? Well, now we know that the possessed Reagan reached out telekinetically and squeezed Father Marin's heart till it stopped beating. I don't know about you, but that's a bit much. But if the telekinetic heart squeezing wasn't enough for you, these scenes also do establish that Reagan is drawing these images that might show the future, and that these synchronized brainwaves can have lasting effects, making it possible for it to communicate telepathically. And you know, the first film, despite showing off this grotesque and over-the-top possessed girl, it still felt real and grounded. This film needs a lot of suspension of disbelief, and it only gets worse from here. Now that the only interesting scene of this movie has come and gone, let's get into the backstory of this demon and the locust, because that is what this entire rest of this movie is about. Father Lamont goes on this journey for the entirety of the second act of this film to try to figure out who this demon is and how to defeat it. He essentially retraces the steps of Father Marin that is hinted at in the opening scene of the first film, and you know, again, those scenes were left cryptic and mysterious with only hints of a larger story for those paying attention, and this film feels the need to spell it out for you. So here's what I got. Father Marin once encountered a young boy named Kokumo who had once been possessed by this demon, whose name is revealed to be Pazuzu. And during this possession, Pazuzu took the form of a swarm of locusts, leading to Kokumo to study science in an attempt to help prevent locust attacks in the future. Now at this point, you get adult Kokumo, played by James Earl Jones, to explain this metaphor of the entire movie to you, who, if you need somebody to dump a bunch of exposition in your movie, why not choose one of the greatest voices of all time to do it? Honestly, James Earl Jones is a big win for this movie. So essentially, this evil is being compared to the hive mind of locusts and how their wings brush together, making them change in personality, causing them to wreak havoc upon the world. He uses science to make them into good locusts that stop this chain reaction of spreading evil amongst the swarm. So we spent the last hour of the movie watching this guy travel the world in tensionless scenes of exposition and boring dialogue just to find out that good is better than bad. Meanwhile, Reagan is busy doing this. This movie is nothing. The priest is boring. Reagan has magical telepathic powers now, while her mom is too busy not wanting to be in this movie. And all that we've learned throughout the entirety of this film is that the ending of the first film is meaningless and that evil is bad. There is nothing in this movie. That one good scene does not make up for the rest of this film being so empty. And it's just that much more frustrating because of the depth that is given to the characters in that first film, that intensity that is brought with those possession scenes, how terrifying those moments are, and those cuts to silence of these characters pondering what they just saw, while this movie just is meandering so much that it just feels entirely hollow and meaningless, and it's just nothing. So let's just get to the end of the movie. Reagan decides to run away for some reason, and Lamont follows her while being in this weird, strange little trance that causes him to be even more of a boring character, but he also begins acting a bit more like a priest.
Be joined with us, Father.
There's a bit of a scuffle, the house blows up, they really never perform an exorcism in a movie called The Exorcism, and since Reagan wasn't ever fully possessed again, they just simply repress Pazuzu once again, resetting us to exactly where the movie began. Also, Sharon burst into flames and died. The end. I honestly don't understand how this movie came to be. Like, even the worst movies, you can see, like, oh, I see the original idea that sparked them to want to make this movie, but nothing happens in the entirety of the runtime. Even The Exorcist Believer has the excuse of the legacy sequel trend to blame for the hollow attempt at recreating the success of that first film, but this one doesn't even feel like it's trying to replicate the first film's success, and in that way, honestly, I have to admire this film for being its own completely different take. At least they took a risk, which sadly did not pay off. And honestly, guys, at this point, I'm convinced that there's no possible way that any sequel to The Exorcist can justify its existence. Why even try to make another film in this series? But at this time, there was a small little development in the world of novels with the release of Legion, the sequel to the book The Exorcist was originally based on. The writer of both books and the writer of the original film signed on as the writer-director to adapt this new story, and if anybody could breathe some life into the series, maybe it's the creator of the whole damn thing. This movie is kind of great and different, with one of the most standout performances in a horror film I've seen in years that apparently is riddled with studio interference. The Exorcist III is fascinating to me. From a story point, I'd say this film is kind of like if Zodiac and The Exorcist had a baby, but from a big picture standpoint, I'd compare this film to The Shining and Dr. Sleep, so let me explain. The Shining is one of my favorite films of all time, a film that for a time lived happily on my Letterboxd top 4 films, and when I heard that Mike Flanagan was adapting the sequel to The Shining, I was both excited and confused. For one, I didn't know how you could possibly make a sequel to The Shining, yet Mike Flanagan was one of my favorite horror directors to date, which of course I will be reviewing The Fall of the House of Usher, which I am unbelievably excited for. But upon watching that film and reading the book by Stephen King, you begin to see that if you make a sequel flow naturally off the end of the first while weaving your own story with these characters, you can make it work. This is exactly what this movie is compared to the first. Hell, the first book is called The Exorcist and the sequel is called Legion, in the same way that The Shining sequel was called Dr. Sleep. If you weren't any the wiser, you'd think that they had nothing to do with each other. This film doesn't follow the McNeil family, once again having to face off against the demon Pazuzu, or any other family for that matter dealing with this demon at all. Yes, this film follows a possession of sorts, but the only real characters to return to this film is Lieutenant Kinderman, who I've yet to talk about. He was attempting to solve the mysterious death of Burke Dennings from the first film, who was found at the bottom of those infamous steps, his head turned completely backwards in a gruesome manner. Although he wasn't entirely the focus of that first film, he did still get some great moments, like when he was trying to decipher if this manner of death could have been by chance or some cruel twist of intent. The most baffling thing in this case, though, was that the sole suspect was a young girl. The Exorcist III takes the idea of a detective trying to solve a murder committed by the possessed and absolutely runs with it. This film opens with some establishing shots of some key players in this film, along with those infamous steps from the first film. This is immediately followed by the most eerie opening titles, establishing the tone of this film right off the bat. You see the stark contrast between the horrific atrocities Kinderman sees as a cop every single day against the seemingly peaceful imagery of a church. This theme will be heavily explored throughout the film, especially as it pertains to the friendship between Kinderman and Father Dyer. So with the tone, characters, and theme set up within the first 15 minutes of this movie, we now get the inciting incident, which follows a priest taking confessions when a voice of an old woman begins to confess these awful murders with gruesome detail. And before this priest can do anything, he becomes the next victim of this killer. Kinderman also tells a story of a young boy who had been crucified recently and believes that the killer of this kid and the priest are one in the same, yet the fingerprints tell a different story. And at this point, I am so into this movie. Kinderman is played excellently by George C. Scott, who gives such weight to his performance here while also having quite a sense of humor. He makes every single scene in this investigation either entertaining or engaging or terrifying depending on the context he is exploring. And at this point, there's only been a few references to the original, with it being 15 years after the death of Father Karras, a short visit to those steps, but besides that, this story stands entirely on its own merits, which I absolutely love. But now we need to cut to a weird, creepy dream sequence with a cameo from Fabio.
Come in, please. Can you hear us? We are attempting to communicate.
The next victim of this killer is sadly Father Dyer. He is killed in the hospital bed in a fascinating manner. In the confession scene, the killer says that blood has been a problem for them, that it's been making too much of a mess and none of the killings have been perfected just yet, which is just such an unsettling thing to say. And Dyer's murder is perfected by this killer. All the blood was drained into these small little jars, and the only blood outside of the jars and outside of Kinderman's body was written on the walls as "It's a Wonderful Life." For those of you paying attention, you may have noticed something interesting about Kinderman's investigation. Upon looking at the past 2 crime scenes, he's been looking at both hands of the victims to try to spot some pattern, and his expression seems to show a familiarity that kind of haunts him. We find out shortly after that these patterns that he's seeing in these killings match the serial killer that he had encountered, known as the Gemini. The MO of this killer was to remove the index finger on the right hand and carve the Gemini symbol onto the palm of the left hand. To top it off, every note the killer left to the cops had any word ending in L featured double L's. Each victim had the name starting with K, and this time around each victim has been found decapitated. All of these things match the 3 murders that we've seen thus far, yet the only issue is the Gemini killer was caught and killed 15 years prior. This movie just keeps on getting more and more interesting, yet this still could have easily been a standalone film not connected to The Exorcist whatsoever. Now, I'm all in for them making an original piece and throwing the established name in the title to, try to cash in some money, but when things actually start to connect to the past, the film actually gets better. Kinderman begins to piece together that a possible connection between all of these victims is the exorcism of Regan MacNeil. Dyer was a good friend of Karis. The first priest approved Regan's exorcism, and the young boy is the son of the linguist that analyzed the tapes of Regan speaking backwards. But why is the killer targeting these victims? Why are the only matches for the fingerprints belonging to catatonic old people who can barely function as it is? When Kinderman goes to investigate, he finds that this man looks exactly like Father Karras, who he had watched die at the bottom of those steps 15 years prior. Now, this is where we get into some of that studio interference I had mentioned. Apparently, the studio wanted Jason Miller to reprise his role for this film, which he does in fact appear in the theatrical version. William Peter Blatty, the writer and director of this film, wanted to cast Brad Dourif as the Gemini killer. So in the theatrical version, we begin to see Miller before he suddenly becomes Dourif in the edit, as his monologues extend throughout a scene. In the director's cut of this film, titled Legion, Miller is cut entirely and we only see Dourif's interpretation as this killer. And honestly, I like the theatrical version better here. I haven't seen the director's cut just yet, which I am honestly dying to watch, but I think it's so creative to cut between the two of them. I think Blatty did a great job at finding some middle ground between what he wanted and the studio, and I think it would have been a bit odd if they were to say that he looks just like Karras, yet we never see him actually look like Karras. But that being said, Brad Dourif is the reason that you should watch this movie. He gives the most chilling performance I have ever seen in a horror film since probably Jack Nicholson in The Shining. Honestly, I think he pulls a lot from that performance here. The mannerisms, the near over-the-top enunciation of every single word, the playful nature of the dialogue feels ripped right out of Jack Torrance. And like I said before, the gruesome details this killer recalls in his monologues are truly disturbing. Less is more here, and even though we've not seen any of these murders committed on screen, our imaginations only make these spoken words worse.
And isn't that really what counts in the end? Yes, of course. Good showbiz, Lieutenant, the effect. And then off comes the head without spilling one single drop of blood. Now, I call that showmanship, Lieutenant.
But how is the Gemini committing these murders despite being locked up in isolation? Well, he is being held in a psychiatric hospital filled with a bunch of old catatonic people who are the easiest to possess. All he needs to do is reach out to one of them and make them do whatever he wants, which is why the fingerprints on all of these murders don't match. It's why these seemingly unconnected people are following the Gemini's MO. I absolutely love this concept. It is such a good idea to have a known serial killer possess others to do his every command. It leads the detective on such a wild goose chase, and the mystery simply writes itself. And best of all, it is so different from that first film while bringing back some characters that had a good jumping off points. The MacNeil's family story was completed. There is no need to revisit those characters, and frankly, there really wasn't a need to revisit Kinderman or Karras in this way, but the film feels mostly natural in the way that it brings them back for a story that feels truly worth telling. Now, of course, there's that one scene that everybody talks about when it comes to this movie that everybody kind of deems as one of the greatest jump scares of all time. You get this long locked off shot in this hallway following this nurse. She peers into a couple of the rooms that she thinks she hears some movements, yet there's nothing ever there. There are a couple of cops even on guard in the background, moving around, doing their own thing, kind of guiding as a misdirect to the audience. There are so many places that a killer could be coming from that you really don't know what could possibly happen. Every time the camera cuts to a different angle, you think that something's going to happen, yet it always goes back to that original wide shot in the hallway until the sound, the zoom, the cut to the decapitated statue, everything about the direction here is masterful. And again, less is more. It's all about the filmmaking, and William Peter Blatty knows how to make a damn good movie. And hey, we get some more great monologues from Brad Dourif. I can live in this tension forever.
Is the torment of your friend, Father Karras, as he watches while I rip and cut and mutilate the innocent, his friends, and again, and again, and on and on.
So now let's get some answers. When the Gemini was executed, his soul was left staring down at his lifeless body, feeling like there was so much more killing to be done. And at the same time, Father Karras had just thrown himself out that window, causing Pazuzu to leave his body. The Gemini refers to Pazuzu as the cruel one, or the master behind all of these events. It felt as if the Gemini's work had yet to be completed, and an offer was made to exact revenge upon all those that expelled Pazuzu from these bodies. This explains the victims, this explains how the Gemini is still around. This gives reason for this being a worthy successor to The Exorcist, not by trying to replicate the first film's success, but rather forging its own path to success. So we are now reaching the end of the film. The Gemini makes an attempt to kill a member of Kinderman's family in a great tension-filled sequence that really had me at the edge of my seat. Now that we know how everything works and we see this old woman slowly making her way to Kinderman's home, you can't help but to expect the worst. He waits until Kinderman gets home to make him watch as he tries to kill his daughter, but luckily a random priest shows up to perform an exorcism. This is where we get some more studio interference in this film. Like I said, the book this film is based on is called Legion, not The Exorcist II or anything pertaining to an exorcism, but of course the studio wanted the IP to sell the tickets, and you can't have a movie called The Exorcist feature no exorcism. So throughout a couple moments throughout this movie, you get to see this other random priest investigating on the side, and he gets this badass entrance into the final act of this movie that is just simply the best. And despite this feeling like it came completely out of left field, which it definitely does, I do think that Blatty made the most of it. The exorcism isn't done in the same way as the previous two films at all, although it does experiment a bit with how things are seen by the audience in a way that is a bit closer to The Exorcist II than the original. At one point, the floor opens up and Karras rises on a crucifix. A snake appears on the Bible being held by the priest. He is raised up to the ceiling and his skin gets peeled off slowly as he tries to get out of the grasp of the spirits. All this is shot extremely well, but you can't help but feel as if it's suddenly become a completely different movie. Like I said, Blatty executed this as well as he possibly could have, despite wanting this movie to end like originally intended, but this is what we get, and honestly, it's fine. I do believe that the director's cut takes a lot of this out, and again, I am so excited to revisit this film in that version out of curiosity to see which cut I like more. And either way, we do get a great finale with Kinderman entering the scene to fight against the spirits in his own way. Throughout the interrogation scenes, the Gemini is mocking Kinderman's unbelief in all of these things, tying it back together to the themes established in the very beginning. His disbelief is that if a god existed, why would he allow such atrocities to exist in this world? And in the end, Kinderman has a great speech about what he does believe.
I believe in slime and stink and in every crawling, putrid thing, every possible ugliness and corruption, you son of a bitch!
Together, the priest and Kinderman are able to hold him off for just long enough for Kinderman to get a couple of shots off, killing the Gemini, and in doing so, saving Karras' soul from the torture that he's been enduring with the Gemini latching himself into his body. And that is The Exorcist III. I came out of this movie completely and utterly shocked with the amount of enjoyment I got out of this film. And yeah, the original is still probably a better film, but honestly, I think I prefer this one. I think it's better paced, the mystery is so damn intriguing, and the performances here are equally, if not even more engaging than the original. The characters in the first film may have a bit more depth, but Kinderman is so fascinating as a character, and the idea of the Gemini and how he is presented here is so original and creative that I find him to be the most interesting character in the series. And most of all, this film does give me that eerie and unsettling feeling while not making my skin crawl to the point of disgust. So hey, this might actually be a yearly watch for me every single Halloween. I've really enjoyed making this deep dive into the Exorcist trilogy, even if it took me way longer than I anticipated. And if you did enjoy this new style of video from me, definitely leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and maybe I'll do some more. Maybe I'll even explore the 2 Exorcist prequels next year to continue the tradition, or maybe a different horror franchise in general. Definitely leave some suggestions down in the comments down below. But either way, those are my thoughts on the Exorcist trilogy. And to answer that initial question I had at the beginning of the video with whether or not the Exorcist needed a sequel to begin with, I'll still say probably not. But if you were to make one, let it stand on its own 2 feet and just make the most of it. Yeah, I am talking to you, David Gordon Green. Do better.